In 1845, a mysterious fungus swept across the fields of Ireland. Within weeks, the potato plants that millions depended on for survival turned black and rotted. The smell of decay hung over entire counties as families faced utter destitution. Families who had eaten nothing but potatoes for generations suddenly had nothing at all. Over the next 7 years, roughly 1 million people starved to death. Another million fled the country on overcrowded ships, many dying at sea before they ever reached land. It was one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 19th century. And at the center of it all was a single crop, a lumpy, dirt-covered root vegetable. Most of Europe had refused to eat it just 100 years earlier. That was 1845. But the story of the potato starts thousands of years before. Before any European ever laid eyes on one, in the majestic Andes Mountains. Roughly 8,000 years ago, high above the cloud line. In what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, wild potato plants grew scattered across the rocky, wind-swept soil at altitudes above 12,000 feet. These were not the golden, starchy potatoes you'd recognize today. They were small, some no bigger than a walnut. They were bitter and genuinely toxic.
The wild potato produces glycoalkaloid compounds that cause nausea, vomiting, cramps, and in severe cases, death.
Eating these things raw was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous.
The indigenous people living in these mountains had figured that out the hard way. Over many generations, they also figured out something else: how to set the course for human agriculture. They discovered that soaking wild tubers in cold mountain streams for days would leach out some of the toxins. The running water would remove harmful compounds, making them safer to eat. Then, exposing the soaked potatoes to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing at high altitude. Where nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below zero, they could break down the remaining harmful compounds and make them safe to eat. It was a painstaking, multi-day process that required patience, experimentation, and an intimate understanding of chemistry.
These ancient farmers would never have described it in those terms, but it worked.
Over thousands of years, through careful selection of the least bitter tubers and replanting of the mildest specimens, generation after generation, Andean farmers slowly bred the poison out and the starch in.
They did not know the word genetics, but they were doing it anyway.
By the time the Inca Empire rose to dominance across western South America around the 1400s, the potato had become something extraordinary. Inca farmers, working the terraced agricultural fields carved into steep mountain slopes around Cusco, and throughout the highland provinces, cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties. Some were bright yellow, some were deep purple, some were red, white, or blue. So dark they looked almost black. They came in shapes ranging from perfectly smooth and round to gnarled, twisted, and lumpy in ways that would have terrified a modern grocery shopper. Each variety was suited to a specific altitude, a specific soil type, a specific microclimate. The Inca did not just grow potatoes. They had built an entire agricultural science around them. And through that science, they had built a civilization. They solved a problem that would stump European farmers for centuries: storage. Fresh potatoes rot. In a world without refrigeration, that is a serious problem. But the Inca technique for making Tuno was brilliant. In its simplicity, farmers would spread freshly harvested potatoes across flat ground at high altitude and let them freeze solid overnight in the bitter Andean cold. The next morning, as the intense equatorial sun warmed the mountainside, families would walk over the frozen tubers barefoot,
squeezing out the moisture with their feet. They repeated this cycle of freezing and stomping for several days,
until what remained was a light, chalky, bone-dry block that weighed almost nothing. Tuno could be stored for 5 years, 8 years, 10 years or more without spoiling. It was arguably the first processed food in human history, and it was a logistical miracle. It fed Inca armies on long military campaigns across the Andes. It sustained entire cities during lean harvest years.
It was so central to Inca life that they measured time partly by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes.
And they measured distance partly by how much tuno a traveler needed to carry between 2 points.
This was not just a crop. It was the foundation of one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas. But the people who would eventually introduce the potato to the rest of the world
had absolutely no appreciation for any of this. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s,
they were looking for gold and silver. They found both in staggering quantities.
What they barely noticed, and certainly did not value, was the ugly little tuber
that the people they were conquering ate at nearly every meal. Spanish soldiers and administrators did bring a few potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula, sometime around 1570. But nobody was particularly excited about it.
There were no celebrations, no royal proclamations.
Potatoes were given to sailors on long voyages as cheap provisions to prevent scurvy. And they were donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown, busy counting Inca gold, had absolutely no interest in promoting a food that came from people they considered savages. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. When the potato finally reached the rest of Europe in the late 1500s and early 1600s,
the reaction ranged from suspicion to outright horror.
and you have to understand the context to see why. In parts of France, the potato was formerly blamed for causing leprosy. Worse still, it belonged to the same botanical family as deadly nightshade.
Which is one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. To many Europeans in deeply religious superstition societies.
This was not a botanical coincidence. It was a warning from God himself. The rumors about potatoes spread faster than the crop itself ever could. In parts of France, the potato was formally blamed for causing leprosy. The Parliament of Besançon actually banned potato cultivation in 1596 on the grounds that it spread the disease. In Russia, the Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin against God.
In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people believed potatoes caused flatulence, uncontrollable desire, scrofula,
which is a form of tuberculosis that causes grotesque swelling in the neck and general moral corruption. Scottish Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible.
And therefore, the crop could not possibly be intended by God for human consumption.
And no, that is not something anyone made up. That was a real theological argument.
Made by real clergymen in real churches for nearly 200 years after arriving in Europe.
The potato sat in gardens, mostly as a botanical curiosity. Wealthy people grew it as an ornamental plant. Its delicate purple and white flowers were considered quite attractive.
Marie Antoinette reportedly wore potato blossoms in her hair at French court events.
Botanical gardens in cities like London, Seville, and Vienna displayed potato plants alongside other exotic specimens.
From the New World. Scholars wrote papers debating whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or dangerous.
But actually eating the thing on a regular basis, that was beneath the dignity of any respectable European.
Potatoes were animal feed at best, and a mark of desperate poverty at worst. In England, even the poorest labourers considered it an insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. The class associations were unmistakable. Bread was civilised, potatoes were not. For a while, the potato seemed stuck in this humiliating position. A rejected, misunderstood crop, growing in the margins of European agriculture, while millions of people went hungry around it. That did not last. War changed it, famine changed it, and a handful of stubborn, slightly eccentric leaders changed it. The first major turning point came in the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick II, known to history as Frederick the Great, ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1786. And he had a very specific problem. His country kept getting dragged into devastating wars with neighbouring powers. And during these wars, enemy armies would burn Prussian wheat fields
to starve the population into submission. Grain was easy to destroy.
You just set fire to it and watched it burn. But a crop that grew underground, completely hidden beneath the soil. An invading army could march right over a potato field, without ever knowing that dinner was 6 inches below their boots. Frederick saw the military potential immediately.
He commanded Prussian peasants to plant potatoes, or face the possibility of having their ears and noses cut off.
The peasants, predictably, were not enthusiastic.
They thought potatoes were unappealing, fit only for livestock. But Frederick was clever.
According to legend, he tried a different approach entirely. He planted a royal potato garden
on the outskirts of Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around the perimeter to guard it.
The message was obvious, without being spoken. If the king himself needed armed guards to protect these plants, they must be extraordinarily valuable. Prussian peasants began sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for themselves. Which, according to the story, was exactly what Frederick had intended all along. And whether every detail of this legend is historically accurate remains debated among scholars. But the result is beyond dispute. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Meanwhile, across the border in France, a determined individual was fighting a similar battle with even more flair.
Parmentier had been a pharmacist, serving in the French army during the 7 Years' War.
And he had been captured by Prussian forces and held as a prisoner of war for 3 years. During his imprisonment, the primary food his Prussian captors gave him was potatoes. Day after day, meal after meal, Parmentier ate potatoes. He did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he came out of captivity in surprisingly decent health, better than many soldiers who had been eating the standard French military diet. This made Parmentier think very hard about everything his own country believed about the potato. After returning to France, Parmentier dedicated the next several decades of his life to a singular mission.
He would convince the French people to eat potatoes if it was the last thing he ever did.
He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society, where every single course, from appetizer to dessert, was made from potatoes.